Hi, welcome to this Blender video tutorial entitled NURBSSurfaces Textures. One would expect that because of the UV characteristics of Blender NURBSSurfaces that they would generate their own UV mapping for texturing. In a sense, this is quite true. NURBSSurfaces self-generate a UV map that can be used when texturing NURBSSurface objects. However, there are some limitations to this self-generated UV mapping. To demonstrate NURBSSurface UV mapping, I've placed a NURBSSurface patch object into my Blender scene. I've extruded it a bit in the U and V directions and manipulated the control vertices to form a wave-like plane object. I'll tab into Edit mode. As you can see, I have checkmarked the U and V endpoint checkboxes and set the U and V order to 5. I'll tab out of Edit mode and go to the Blender Materials Editor and add a new material. I'll name this material Wave. I will, for now, leave all of the default material settings and go to the Texture Editor and add a new texture. I'll name this texture Numbers. I'll change the type to Image or Movie and click on the Open button in the Image panel. This opens up Blender's file locator. I will select the UV Numbers JPEG image located in the NURBS Texture Demo folder located on my desktop. In the Mapping panel, I'll accept the default generated flat mapping. Then I'll render the scene. As you can see, the default generated flat mapping works quite well for this object and this image texture. Note that this has been rendered in slot number 1 in the UV image editor. I'll select slot number 2, then go back to the 3D editor and tab into Edit mode. I'll select these two top control vertices and move them down along the Z-axis to form a curve at the top of the object. I'll box select the left set of control vertices and scale them down a bit to create a bottom and top curve at this end of the object. I'll then render the scene. Note that with the default flat generated mapping, the image is cut off along the top and left side curves. I'll switch back and forth between render slot number 1 and render slot number 2 to show the difference between the two renderings. I'll select render slot number 3 and then go back to the 3D viewport. I'll go to the Object Data Editor and open up the Texture Space panel. Here I will uncheck the default Auto Texture Space checkbox and checkmark the Use UV for Mapping checkbox. Note that the box is described as uses the UV values as generated texture coordinates. In effect, this swaps out the regular Blender-generated map for a UV self-generated map. I'll then render the scene. As you can see, the image is now completely mapped to the object using the object's surface as the UV mapping coordinates. I'll switch to render slot number 2 to show the difference between checkmarking Use UV for Mapping and Auto Texture Space. There are some obvious limitations to the self-generated UV mapping for NURBSSurface objects. Firstly, unlike mesh objects that can be unwrapped, there is no unwrapping of the NURBSSurface to the UV editor, and thus the UV surface map cannot be edited to the image like one might do with a mesh object. Secondly, there is no functionality to either mark seams on a NURBSSurface object or to selectively edit portions of the UV map. NURBS surface self-generated UV mapping is essentially a one-size-fits-all process. There are, however, some functions in the texture editor that can augment the map. I'll select render slot number 4. In the texture editor mapping panel, I'll change the X and Y size to 2. This will double the image in both the U and V directions. I'll then render the scene. Here is the difference between render slot number 3 at an XY size of 1 and render slot number 4 at an XY size of 2. The offset controllers in the mapping panel have no effect on a textured NURBS surface. However, all of the controllers in the image mapping panel will affect the rendering, as will all of the controllers in the image sampling panel. For instance, here I will checkmark the Flip XY axis checkbox. I'll select render slot number 5, and I'll render the scene. I will uncheck the Flip XY checkbox, then select render slot number 6, and go back to the 3D viewport. I'll tab out of edit mode and go to layer number 2. I'll select the object and tab into edit mode. Here I have modeled a vase-like object by extruding and scaling a NURBS surface circle object. I'll go to the Object Data Editor. Note here that the vase has the U and V order set to 5. I'll go to the Blender Materials Editor, and I'll add a new material. I'll name this material Vase. I will, for now, leave all of the default material settings and go to the Texture Editor, and I'll select the existing Numbers texture. In the Mapping panel, I'll change the default generated flat mapping to generated tube mapping. Note that the XY size is still set to 2. I'll then render the scene. Note that the default generated tube mapping works fairly well on the NURBS surface vase object. I'll select render slot number 7 and go back to the 3D editor. I'll go to Side View and select these 2 control vertices located at the top right of the vase. I'll then press the G key and move them down a bit. I'll do the same thing on the left side of the vase. I'll then render the scene. Again, as we saw earlier, using the default generated, this time tube mapping, the image is cut off at the rim curve of the vase. I'll select render slot number 8, and then go to the Object Data Editor. Here I will uncheck Auto Texture Space and check Use UV for mapping. I'll then render the scene. Note the completely distorted image texturing. I will go back to the texture editor. Note that in the mapping panel, the projection is still tube. When using the NURBS surface self-generated mapping, the projection needs to be set to flat, no matter what the shape of the NURBS surface. I'll change this to flat projection, and I'll render the scene. Now the self-generated UV mapping is applied to the image. I'll switch between render slot number 7, that uses the default auto texture space generated tube mapping, and render slot 8, that uses the NURBS surface self-generated mapping. Although limited in scope, the NURBS surface self-generated mapping will work on many modeling situations. Modelers always have the option to select the NURBS surface object, press Alt-C and convert the NURBS surface to a mesh, and then have access to the regular unwrapping and UV editing tools. One last important note regarding NURBS surface self-generated texture mapping is that the UV surface mapping demonstrated here will not work on any NURBS surface object that contains a mirror modifier. Nor can a mirror modifier be permanently applied to a NURBS surface object.